The most dangerous word in geopolitics is the word ceasefire, because it persuades people that a war has ended when in truth it has only changed its clothes. Tonight I want to take you inside the ceasefire that was signed in early April, the one I told you to expect before it arrived. And then I want to do something far more uncomfortable. I want to show you why that ceasefire was never the end of this war, why it was in fact the opening act of a larger and more dangerous one, and why the real war, the war that matters, is only now beginning to take shape in front of us. Because what we are watching in early June, as Israel and Iran trade their heaviest strike since April, is not a ceasefire breaking down. It is the real war coming into focus. Let me explain why I told you to expect the ceasefire. Because the prediction was not a guess, and the reasoning matters more than the result. After roughly 5 weeks of open fighting that began on the 28th of February, the structural conditions for a pause had matured precisely. Iran had closed the Strait of Hormuz, but in doing so had trapped its own oil, sending crude loadings, tumbling and stranding tens of millions of barrels inside the Gulf. The United States had inflicted enormous damage, but had not achieved the clean, decisive outcome it wanted, and oil prices surging toward $13 a barrel, with American gasoline up nearly 30%, were generating political costs at home. Both sides had reached a point where the immediate continuation of maximum fighting was more painful than a pause. That is the condition that produces a ceasefire, saw both sides arriving at it simultaneously. The forecast was straightforward. The ceasefire came on the 7th and 8th of April, almost exactly as the structure indicated. Here's what you need to understand before we go further, and it is the thesis of everything that follows. A ceasefire is not peace. A ceasefire is a tactical pause that occurs when both sides conclude that fighting at full intensity is temporarily more costly than stopping. It resolves nothing. It addresses none of the underlying grievances. It simply gives each side time to reposition, to resupply, to recalculate, and to prepare for the next phase on better terms. 3 questions will drive this analysis. First, what did each side actually use the ceasefire to do? Second, why does the structure tell us this pause was always going to give way to something larger? And third, what does the real war, the one now emerging, actually look like? By the end, you will understand why I believe the April ceasefire was not the end of a war, but the eye of a storm, and why the back half of that storm is the half that will be studied for generations. Let me begin with what each side actually did with the pause, because actions during a ceasefire reveal intentions that words conceal. Watch what happened in the days and weeks after the early April truce. On the 13th of April, after talks in Islamabad collapsed, the United States imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports. This is not the behavior of a power that believes the war is over. This is the behavior of a power shifting from kinetic warfare to economic warfare, from missiles to siege. The blockade, by various estimates, was costing Iran between $500 million a day by the administration's claim and nearly $6 billion in total lost oil revenue by late May. Iran, for its part, used the pause to seize cargo ships, to reposition its forces, and to test the boundaries of what it could do without triggering a full resumption. Neither side behaved as though the war had ended. Both behaved as though it had merely entered a new phase. And that is precisely what a ceasefire is. It is the seam between phases, not the end of the conflict. Let me deepen this because the mechanics of why a ceasefire holds or breaks are the mechanics of the entire war. A ceasefire is a moment of equilibrium, and equilibria are only stable when neither party believes it can improve its position by moving. The instant either side concludes that resuming the fight or shifting to a new form of fighting would yield a better outcome than the status quo, the equilibrium breaks. Now apply that to what we have observed. The United States concluded almost immediately that it could improve its position by shifting from kinetic strikes to economic siege. And so it imposed a blockade. Iran concluded that it could improve its position by seizing ships and repositioning forces. Each side, in other words, treated the ceasefire not as a stopping point, but as a chance to change the terms of the contest in its own favor. That is the opposite of peace. Peace is when both sides stop, looking for an advantage. A ceasefire is when both sides pause the shooting while they keep looking. And as long as both keep looking, the structure guarantees that one of them will eventually find a move worth making, and the fighting in one form or another resumes. This is why I keep telling you that the quiet weeks are the most dangerous, because the quiet is not resolution. It is reconnaissance. This brings us to the second question, the structural one. And here I want to be very precise. Why was this pause always going to give way to something larger? The answer lies in a concept that every student of war must internalize. The difference between a ceasefire and a peace is the difference between exhaustion and resolution. A ceasefire reflects exhaustion, peace reflects resolution, and the conditions for resolution, the simultaneous conclusion by both sides that the terms available are better than any outcome they could achieve by fighting, did not exist in April and do not exist now. Iran cannot accept terms that ratify the killing of its supreme figure and the strangling of its economy, because to do so would be existential for the regime. The United States cannot accept terms that look like failure after the scale of force it committed. When neither side can accept resolution, a ceasefire is not a destination. It is a way station. And way stations are always temporary. Let me give you the historical frame, because history is unambiguous on this point. The armistice that ended the fighting of the First World War in 1918 was not a peace. It was a pause that left the underlying grievances unresolved. And 20 years later, those grievances produced a far larger and more catastrophic war. The Korean armistice of 1953 was not a peace. It froze a conflict that has never formally ended and that periodically flares to this day. Across the long record of human conflict, ceasefires that pause exhausted wars without resolving the grievances beneath them tend to do one of two things. They either freeze into permanent tense standoffs, or they give way to a second and often larger war once both sides have recovered enough to fight again. The April ceasefire, signed under exhaustion and under pressure, did not resolve the underlying conflict, it merely suspended it. It belongs to a category of pauses in history that appear, at first glance, to signal de-escalation, but in reality function as temporary stabilizations inside a continuing strategic struggle. The central question such moments always leave unanswered is not whether fighting stops, but what form the conflict takes when it inevitably resumes. Does it move toward resolution, or does it evolve into a prolonged pattern of managed instability? One useful way to understand this is through historical precedent, particularly the Cold War. That era never truly contained a final settlement between the great powers. Instead, it produced a long sequence of controlled crises each one intense enough to threaten escalation but ultimately contained before reaching open war. From the Berlin blockade to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and across multiple proxy conflicts on different continents, the pattern remained consistent. Confrontation, tension, partial de-escalation, and then renewed confrontation. None of these episodes ended the Cold War, but each shaped its boundaries. What prevented that prolonged rivalry from collapsing into direct great power war was not peace in any meaningful sense, but a shared, deeply internalized fear of catastrophic escalation. Both sides understood, often with brutal clarity, that certain thresholds could not be crossed without risking mutual destruction. The system that emerged was therefore not stable because it was resolved, but because it was constrained by fear. It was a managed instability held together by deterrence rather than reconciliation. That same structural logic now offers a lens through which to interpret the emerging conflict in the present. What we are likely observing is not a single decisive war with a clear beginning and end, but rather a sequence of paused crises, each one temporarily contained, each one leaving the underlying contradictions intact, and each one potentially more dangerous than the last. The risk in such a system is not that it fails immediately, but that one of these pauses through miscalculation, accident, or escalation beyond intent breaks containment and transforms the entire structure. Within that framework, the April ceasefire can be understood as the first of several such pause crises. It did not conclude the conflict, it merely reset its intensity. The implication is that more such moments are likely and that each one will test the limits of restraint more severely than the last. The danger lies not in the visibility of escalation, but in the accumulation of unresolved tension beneath repeated temporary stabilizations. From here, the central question becomes what the real war actually looks like. Importantly, it does not take a single form. Instead, it branches into several distinct trajectories, each with its own logic, risks, and endpoint. Standing at this fork, we can identify at least three broad possibilities. The first and most immediately likely form is a war of attrition, a prolonged siege-like conflict defined less by decisive battles and more by sustained pressure over time. In this scenario, direct military exchanges remain relatively contained, fluctuating between flare-ups and temporary truces, while the real struggle unfolds in economic, logistical, and systemic dimensions. Energy flows, financial pressure, trade disruption, and sustained economic strain become the primary instruments of war. In this model, Iran's economy is gradually constrained through restrictions on exports and maritime pressure, while regional stability is eroded through uncertainty in shipping and investment. At the same time, Iran attempts to adapt by finding alternative channels, rerouting exports, relying on intermediaries, and absorbing the pressure through internal resilience mechanisms. The result is not collapse or victory in a conventional sense, but mutual exhaustion. What makes this form of war particularly significant is that it is easily underestimated precisely because it lacks dramatic focal points. There is no single decisive battle, no clear turning point, only a continuous erosion of capacity and endurance. Yet, it is within this slow accumulation of pressure that outcomes are determined. The decisive factor becomes not battlefield dominance, but which system, economic, political, and social, can endure sustained strain for longer without breaking. The second possible trajectory is a wider regional escalation where containment fails and the conflict expands across multiple fronts. In this version, the logic of restraint breaks down under the weight of a triggering event. That trigger could take several forms. A high-casualty strike that forces political retaliation, the death of American personnel that compels direct involvement, the collapse of a fragile diplomatic framework, or an accidental escalation that neither side intended but neither can ignore. In such a scenario, the conflict rapidly shifts from controlled attrition to regional confrontation. What had been a contained pressure system expands outward, drawing in additional actors and opening new theaters of conflict. The defining feature of this transition is speed. Once certain thresholds are crossed, escalation would not unfold gradually, but abruptly, potentially within days. History shows that wars of this type often do not build slowly, they tip suddenly. The third trajectory is a frozen standoff, in which active conflict gradually diminishes, but the underlying hostility never resolves. In this outcome, the intensity of confrontation declines over time. Ceasefires become more durable, and direct clashes become less frequent. However, the structural grievances remain intact. The result is a long-term condition of armed coexistence, hostile, unstable, and permanently tense, but not continuously violent. This resembles neither peace nor war in the traditional sense, but something closer to a stabilized antagonism. Military readiness remains, political hostility persists, but the system no longer cycles through constant escalation. It is a fragile equilibrium, sustained not by trust or resolution, but by fatigue and deterrence. To understand these trajectories fully, it is essential not to reduce them to abstract strategic models alone. Behind every economic indicator, every disrupted shipment, and every diplomatic signal are real human consequences. Populations on all sides absorb the costs in the form of economic pressure, insecurity, and psychological strain. Even those directly involved in negotiations or detention cases become embedded within the larger structure of the conflict, illustrating how individual lives are drawn into systemic dynamics. It is also important to recognize that one of the defining features of this situation is asymmetry of preparation. Certain states and actors have spent years, in some cases decades, preparing for precisely this kind of sustained pressure. They have built redundancy into supply chains, diversified strategic networks, and developed mechanisms for absorbing external shocks while maintaining internal continuity. This level of preparation does not make them immune to pressure, but it does make rapid collapse unlikely. That reality is central to why the attrition model is so plausible. Systems that are designed to endure pressure rarely fail quickly. Instead, they tend to degrade slowly, adapting at each stage. This is what makes the siege dynamic, both durable and dangerous. It resists resolution and extends the timeline of conflict. Bringing these threads together, the most important conclusion is that the April ceasefire was not an endpoint, but a transition point. It marked the exhaustion of one phase and the beginning of another. What follows is not peace, but a structured continuation of conflict in a different form, most likely dominated by attrition, punctuated by intermittent crises, and shadowed by a persistent risk of sudden escalation. In the near term, the system is likely to oscillate between relative calm and localized flare-ups. Whether this oscillation gradually stabilizes into a frozen standoff or breaks into wider war depends on a small number of critical pressure points: the survival of fragile diplomatic frameworks, the management of military thresholds, and the avoidance of catalytic incidents that can rapidly overwhelm restraint. The key structural feature of this entire situation is the asymmetry between gradual change and sudden rupture. Movement towards stabilization, if it occurs, tends to be slow